Take a publicly held company and split it into two. Then decide that it's the perfect time to simultaneously move both of them almost exclusively to the cloud. This is the story of Newscorp, 21st Century Fox, and the CIO who was just crazy enough to do it. I'm Charles Araujo, and this is the TransformIT Show, presented by the Intel IT Center. I recently sat down with Rich Roseman, the former CIO at 21st Century Fox, to discuss his career, his time working with the Olympics, and his wild ride splitting up Newscorp. I'm here with Rich Roseman, the former CIO at 21st Century Fox, and you'll hear the rest of his story in just a minute. So, Rich, welcome to the TransformIT Show.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about this particular conversation because you've had this fascinating career, and we'll kind of get to, I think, the real story that we're going to dive into. But I want to start by just kind of getting to the context of how you ended up in this role at Newscorp, because you started actually not in IT at all, and then working within NBC and kind of working at the Olympics, which is really cool, and you can tell us a little bit about that. And then that kind of set the stage for this really interesting story that we're going to talk about at Newscorp today. So kind of just give us a little bit of your background and how you got here.
Sure. Well, I think, Charlie, it was a twisted path, as you say. I started out in finance. That's where my first job was and it was in finance at NBC. But it became evident after a couple of years my true passion was technology, or what passed for technology at that time. Finance was not my passion, and that was also evident. So after some very interesting turn of events at NBC in the late 80s, I was afforded the opportunity to move into the technology side of the business, and ever since then it's been one role after another in IT.
And so just very briefly, just because I think it's really fun, so talk a little bit about your time with the Olympics and just what that time was like.
That was a great time. I was involved with the Olympics in Barcelona in '92 and the Atlanta Olympics in '96. Phenomenal events. It was very exciting. It was a project-based effort where you build up, you actually do the Olympics, then you break down. But the pace, there was no failure. Schedules they were going to light the Olympic torch on a certain day at a certain time, and you had to be ready. So in that way, it was unique from a lot of jobs where you can slide deadlines around. But you had to have passion for it, and it was just a great job. Great job.
So that led you to a point where eventually you went through that, and we don't need to have all the details, but you became the CIO at Newscorp through that process, right?
Yeah. Well, I left NBC Olympics because of the travel became too much after our first child was born. I was literally gone 4 or 5 months at a time. So. For a brief interim period, I worked for a company called Quokka Sports, which was a web-based company partially owned by NBC, partially owned by a company based in San Francisco. The idea was to put the Olympics, the 2000 and 2002 Olympics, on the internet, to be able to offer an alternative means of viewing it versus traditional TV. The only problem was broadband penetration at the household was not really high enough in the year 2000 to make that a worthwhile effort, and watching an event with a dial-up modem was not a great fit. So I ended up leaving there and going to News America Marketing, which was owned by Newscorp at the time. And then in 2006, I became the CIO for what was Newscorp and is now 21st Century Fox.
So now you're at Newscorp, and you found yourself in a very interesting position because you were part of the executive team that was taking Newscorp and splitting it into two publicly held companies. And if I'm understanding the story right, as part of that, you also took advantage of this opportunity to really substantially move both of these companies into the cloud. Right. And so kind of set the context for what I think some of the lessons maybe that you learned through this process.
And let me start out by saying I was a naysayer of the cloud. My first conference I went to about the cloud, if one more person stood up and gave their definition of the cloud, I think I was going to lose it. I thought it was a fad. I thought it was a marketing ploy. I didn't think it was going to be around more than a year or 2 years. My watershed moment was the U.S. Open in 2011. I was a guest of IBM. There was a rain delay. They took us to go see the IBM cloud operation at the U.S. Open in Flushing, Queens. And that was my moment. I walked in and I saw what they did with how few people they did it and the flexibility they had. I said, I get it. I came back to the office. I said, gentlemen, we've got to go to the cloud. In 2012, Newscorp announced they were separating the company into two independent firms, one focused on print, the other focused on electronic. This was our moment to move to the cloud. So there were two things we did. One was to take the existing company and move it to the cloud, over 90% of its infrastructure to the cloud. And the other was to stand up the new company and build that from the ground up on the cloud. So while they were both two cloud transformation projects, one was as I said, one was a transformation to the cloud, the other was a birth on the cloud. And we decided to do them both at the same time.
Because you just
'Cause we
decided
could.
you need something to do, right?
Well,
I mean, it sounds very ambitious. I mean, like almost the opposite of what a lot of people would do. It's like, oh my gosh, with this kind of a massive transition, then let's hunker down, not change anything, and try
Sure.
to keep it as simple as we can.
Well, there was a spirit of change in the air, and you know, politics and budgets are all play a factor in this. And since there was a willingness to make changes, I think, well, strike while the iron's hot. What really was a driving factor for the print business, which today is known as Newscorp, was there was no management at the time. They had no staff. They had no infrastructure. Why would you want to build that up from scratch? So that was an easy cloud decision. On the electronic side, or what today is 21st Century Fox, we had to make some investments anyway. To me, it made no sense to reinvest in proprietary hardware, data center space, and everything that goes with that. So while we were, you know, the patient was on the table, we did it all, and we had a very finite 12-month window to do it in, and there was no give or take. It was, you need to be ready on July 1st, 2013.
So just another Olympics, basically.
It was another Olympics. and you know, to me, it was enjoyable because I like that pressure and I like those defined deadlines. Other people were like, we only have 12 months, what are we going to do? And my answer was, get it done. And we can spend our time talking about those 12 months and what we like or don't like about it, but you can't change it. So
I don't know how this happened, but I feel like in IT, you know, my joke is that in IT, schedules have turned into kind of like the road signs in Mexico. They're kind of more suggestions than rules, and because it's true. I mean, I think that I ran a project once many years ago when I was working in healthcare, and we had like 8 teams, and my team was the only one that hit our schedule. It's like I thought we had to hit this, and it's like, oh well, yeah, maybe not. So.
Well, I liken it back to my growing up years in broadcasting, right? You had to, as I said, if they're going to light the Olympics on, you know, the torch on July 14th at 8 o'clock at night, you had to be ready, and I need that mentality. And yes, too often if things become difficult in IT, people pick up a deadline and move it. And my definition is that's not a deadline, that's a suggested target date.
Right.
But I don't want to just pick on IT. I know this is what you're talking about today, but I find all the disciplines, if something becomes too hard, I don't do that. I just, you've got to get it done. It's just that simple.
So I want to use this because I think it's a very interesting situation. The combination of both, one, dividing a company into 2 publicly held companies and effectively standing them up, and then moving to the cloud at the same time, I think is a great context. But I want to dive into kind of some of the underpinnings because I think, you know, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, is that the technology changes, but the essence of leadership and how do you execute,
Right.
you know, are consistent and remain. And so one of the things that we chatted about was that you had to really deal with this idea of uncertainty, that things were changing very, very rapidly. And so I guess what is the lesson, or maybe share some of the stories that kind of exemplify that?
Well, yeah. You know, I think the major lesson is nothing is done until it's done, which sounds kind of, you know, tongue in cheek, but the point is things are fluid, things change, which does make it difficult to run a project because you need some certainty in some direction. Things like namings of the companies. We went through various scenarios of what the company was going to be called. We thought we had it nailed down. This is the night that we're going to switch all of our URLs and all of our internal services to the new company name. Noon comes, I send a note out to people and said, any pushback, we're good to go. Radio silence. 6 p.m. Eastern comes up. I'm dealing with a lot of people on the West Coast. 6 p.m. Eastern comes up. I send another note out. This is it. Anything? Silent. So I call my team. I said, okay, let's go. Start it. They start the process. That night, I go out to pick up one of our children who were at a friend's house, and I decided to leave my phone at home because I figured what could go wrong now? I get it back in the house 15 minutes later. The phone is vibrating, blinking, buzzing, smoking. Stop everything. We've decided to change the company name. So I now have to pick up the phone and say to everybody, stand down, revert back, which was not an easy thing to do because we never developed plans to back out, right? We knew how to change the name. We knew the sequence we had to go through. But the point is, something simple as naming of a company was somewhat problematic, and we eventually got through it. But it took us months after that to finally come to resolution. That's certainly something people need to be aware of. Is just fluidity and the ability to ad hoc make changes. That's tough. Getting people to commit and stick to a commitment, not just in naming, but in terms of business process. The other challenge is for a new company, there was no management. And part of the early plan was there would be a management team in place that could help guide us, and we could give them suggestions on what they should do to run this company from an IT perspective. Well, as September became November, as November became February, it was clear to us that these people were not going to be in place in time to help us make these decisions. So instead of us simply acting as an advisory where here's our playbook, this is what we suggest you do, we had to turn to execution mode. So there again, it was a fluid situation where we had to change hats and say, okay, now we're not just the architect, we're the builder. And then guess what? We're not just the builder, we're the maintenance
And
people.
I think this is going to be a much more common situation. When we talked about this, why it resonated with me is that I think we're moving into this time in which everything is moving much more quickly.
Sure.
And everything is much more fluid as organizations try to respond to the market and react to market changes and opportunities. So what is the lesson in that? I mean, what is it that you brought to the table that helped you? I mean, you successfully led your team through this.
Well, I think it's you can't be short-sighted. You have to be open to alternatives, and you got to always think about, well, if not A, B, and if not B, C, and if it's C, D, and you have to be able to go through this list, kind of like a quarterback staying up at the line and saying, okay, well, this isn't the defense I expected, so let me make a change. I think the core decisions remained. We knew we wanted to go cloud. We knew what providers we're going to go with. We knew what we had to move to the cloud or build for the cloud. But it was how to integrate with the business. And I don't like to necessarily separate IT from the business. I believe that IT is as much of the business as any other discipline is. And I think IT professionals tend to set themselves up as second-class citizens by saying, well, the business wants this. You don't tend to hear it from HR or finance. But you have to work with the other disciplines in the company to get things done. And let's talk about legal for a moment. The decision to go to the cloud, from a technology perspective, it was simple. We believed the technology was mature enough and the providers we had selected were robust enough. But getting the process through legal was probably the biggest single longest ticket that we had to go through. And I say it's because the attorneys were trained in law school on traditional IT type of contract relationships. This whole idea of it's not within our four walls, the data, or we don't own the infrastructure, or we don't know where in North America the data is very scary to them. And it took enormous effort to get through.
So
that.
let's pick up on that a little bit, because I know that we were talking and you said that, well, one of the things is that using the cloud as the metaphor, but again, this isn't about the technology. I think
Right.
that we're gonna repeat this cycle over and over again. Is that it wasn't just impacting IT, right? And I think that you said this whole situation with legal kind of demonstrated that to you. So what were some of the lessons you learned or approaches you took where it was about kind of educating people about the future and about how maybe some of the things, the way they've always worked, not just within IT, but for the entire organization, were in fact going to change? I mean, how did you approach that?
Well, and I think what helped is the world is going this way. So I wasn't the one carrying the flag first through the door, but educating them on the fact that it is nothing in the world is safe, right? Even if data is within our own four walls of a data center that we thought was our own, but never was. We always leased space. So you take security off the table. And look, I think if people want to use security as an excuse or as a roadblock to not do something, it certainly will tie things up, but I don't think it's any more risky than previous. Legal, as I said, the lesson learned there is get contracts, get the T's and C's in front of your legal team like the minute the vendor walks through the door, because it's going to take numerous cycles to get through this. To let people understand that there's going to be no difference in their day-to-day work of what technology we put behind it, right? The typical end user, they don't know where the service resides, nor should they. But there's this buzz out there, well, cloud is different. Well, it is from an IT perspective, but if done correctly from an end user perspective, there really shouldn't be a change. So a lot of it was overcoming, the rumors are usually worse than the truth. And it was making people understand that this is going to make us more flexible, speed to market, and then also educating the finance people that dollar savings, cost savings, while true today, is not a reason to do the cloud, I don't believe, because I think that economics will change over time as there's less and less on-prem and capital. I think cloud providers will start to ratchet up what you're paying pennies for to nickels, dimes, quarters. But you sell it in as the speed and efficiency. Cost today is great. So from the finance people, educate them that this probably will change. From the end user, educate them that life will not change. From legal, there's plus and minuses to everything, and have to get used to it. And then also from the internal IT team, there was fear about jobs. People were concerned, well, I'm going to lose my job because you're outsourcing this, we're going to SaaS. No, their jobs changed, and frankly, it became a more interesting job for them than a mechanical kind of tactical
So
job.
I want to digress for one moment, because right before we started filming, you were talking about your time at the Olympics and how how different it would be now if you were in that role.
Sure.
And so what I'm curious about is, again, I'm not so much interested in the technology, but you just said something that I really strongly believe in, that the value of the cloud is not the cost, but it's about what you can do. So kind of just to kind of go back to those days about how you had to do stuff in your time of the Olympics and what it looks like now, because I think it was fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I did it, it was very, what I would say was hardware intense. We would start, 2 years before games, right? We'd start to go look at the broadcast center, would build out a data center or a computer room. We'd get hardware, would burn it in, we'd have to break it down, we'd have to ship it, we'd have to install it, deal with customs if it was overseas. A lot of overhead, a lot of effort to move assets from one location to another. That's no longer the case, right? Their footprint in a data center, in a broadcast center, is much smaller than it was because everything is cloud-based. The other less technical side is we used to produce this probably 14-book set of research manuals that covered every sport, every athlete, every country, everything that any reporter, commentator, or anchor needed to know about the Olympics. This information was outdated before it came off the press, but that's all we had in '96. Today, and by the way, we ship those books all over the world. Not just one set, but like 12.
I thought these commentators just knew all this stuff. Not the case, huh?
They're not all as smart as you and I are, Charlie. No, but there are a lot of little factoids because there's researchers that follow these athletes around for years before the games. And they literally travel the world. That doesn't change. But the idea is now the information can be fresh, it can be real time, and if there is a change, in '92 in Barcelona, right, the Soviet Union had just fallen, Russia's now here, a new country, people didn't know what national anthems to play, people didn't know what the flags looked like. So there's a very fluid situation where the research manuals probably weren't good for that type of information because they were done in 90, 91, when there still was, so that's the difference. Just the speed of information, what we would have to go through in terms of providing services at a venue, months of planning, there was no Wi-Fi. The internet was in its infancy in '96, really wasn't that impactful to our operations. So today I look at the people who have taken over after I did, and I saw this gentleman several months ago, and I'm like, wow, must be nice. I'm sure he has his challenges.
Right.
But you weren't taking containers and containers of hardware.
But I think that's the point. I mean, I get so frustrated talking to people, and specifically around the cloud, and they want to make it all about the technology. And to me, it's all about the business agility that you get from it. And I just think that's a great example.
You have to approach it. I approach things as a business person first, right? And to me, the cloud is no different than walking in this room and turning the lights. You assume it's going to work. It should work, and it's expected to work. That's not the focus. The focus is how can it help drive revenue, reduce cost. And I think if you nail those two things, the technology is the least important.
So let's switch gears and go back a little bit. And I know it's probably just a little bit sensitive, so you play it how you want to. But in terms of, we talked a little bit about truth telling and the time during this whole transition. And I think probably the more essence of that is how do we communicate? And I think we're in this world where things are moving so quickly and the margin of error is so small. How do we have to change the way we communicate especially within corporate environments, I think?
I think the change is kind of old-fashioned, but it's to be truthful and be forthright. No one, I believe, likes to deliver bad news. Very few people like to deliver bad news. Everybody wants everyone else to think that their area of expertise, it's all running well, no problem. Well, A, that's not real. And B, sooner or later, you've got to step up to the bar and confess the sins of the past, because if the problem's either going to be done, the project's going to be done or it's not done, and I'd rather let you know we have little problems every week than suddenly, at the 99th minute of the day say, guess what, we're 3 months behind. People need to communicate just, as honestly as they can, as transparent as they can. I know the word transparent is used ad nauseum these days, but the fact is, I can work, and I'll just talk about myself for a minute, I can work with information. If there's something that needs to be addressed, let's talk about it. That old, you're at the fork in the road and there's a big oak tree in front of you, that's kind of late to say, guess what, there's a fork in the road. I can't do anything at that point. But as soon as a team sees a problem, I ask them to bring it to the top. And, we would have these meetings about the separation, weekly meetings. And I called it the feel-good meetings, because you sit around this room with 40 people, and every work stream would report in, and
Perfect.
everybody, we're green, we're good, we're good. Now, I'm sitting there as the head of the IT work stream, and I kind of have a global view because all these other work streams rely on IT, and I'm not looking at the same book, okay? I see these holes. I see lack of people, lack of decisions, lack of go-forward movement. And the weeks are becoming months, and the months are becoming quarters of the year. And this date is there, right? This July 1, 2013 is there. Sooner or later, I was always the one that had to deliver, well, not exactly. When are we going to have this? When are we going to have that? And I'm not sitting here, patting myself on the head, but the fact is, if other people were honest with themselves, and I'm not saying they were intentionally trying to mislead, but they wanted to hold back because they didn't want to deliver the full picture. So I think it goes back to the basics of communication, in your personal life as well as professional, which is tell the truth, tell what you know as soon as you possibly can, and then we can all collectively make changes.
And I think it's hard. We all want to look like we're doing a good job. We all, well, most of us, I think, are trying to do a good job. And to your point, these weren't all IT people around this table, right? So this isn't an IT problem per se. It's a human issue.
Yes.
But I think IT in particular, a lot of times because we don't always have the interpersonal skills. This is actually a much more challenging. I remember this one time. I was working with an organization, and we were kind of serving as advisors to the CIO, and they had this project, and he asked me to do this assessment. And so we look at it, and they had been projecting in their presentation to the board was it was going to be $100 million over 3 years, and I looked at it, it's going to be $300 million over 5 to 7 years. And he goes, yeah, but I can't tell them that. It's like, well, why not, right? And because they want to prove it. It's like, well, then maybe you should do it.
Right.
And it did. It took 3 years. It took 5 years and cost $300 million. And so it ended up exactly where we all knew it was going to be, right. But they were afraid to say it. How do you overcome that? How do you do it?
And didn't the board know at the end of year one it was no longer going to be 1 year and $100 million, right? Because that's my point. Sooner or later they're going to find out anyway, and you'd look much better and be perceived much better if you up front said it's going to be $300 million in 5 years. How do you do it? I think you have to stress to people, look, no one knows everything, right? There's going to be unplanned events are going to creep up, and you can't account for those up front. But communicate. And, I think where it kind of starts is a lot of times IT is pigeonholed into a budget and a time frame. People will say, I want to do this, I want to build this table, how long is it going to take? Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about what material you want it made out of, how big do you want the table, those types of things. And people get pigeonholed because they want to seem like a hero. I can build this in 3 months and $10,000. You might get lucky. You might do it in 1 month for $5,000. But you know what? It may turn out to be $300 million in 5 years. I think as an industry, as a profession, we need to take a step back and say, let us go look at this. Still be agile. I'm not saying we should do waterfall and all kinds of documents, but give us a few days to just go back and kind of scope it out roughly.
I think that's you and I talked about this before we started filming. That I think that one of the hallmarks of true intelligence is to be willing to say I don't know, right? And I think it's kind of what you just said is let's start these conversations with especially in this era where everything is so new in a lot of ways, we don't know.
So I'll give you a perfect example. I worked for a gentleman once, great guy, and we kind of got him off of trying to corner us into when will the project be done. And he'd turn around and say, well, in order of magnitude, is this a small, medium, or large project? Okay. Now, that's the fact is he had predisposed that a medium was X period of time and large was, so it didn't matter. He was asking the same question. And it's like, no, we can't do this. We've got to go back and take a look at it. I know everybody wants answers up front, but I think the true professional response would be give us a few days, a week, depending on how big and what it is, to come back and give you a real gut, educatedly based gut estimate of what it's going to take.
Right.
But people don't want to be seen as flat on their feet, not knowing the answer. But no one knows the answer to everything. And yeah, I'd rather someone say I don't know. I expect them to then go get the answer, than to sit there and
And if they don't accept that, then maybe that tells you a little bit about.
Well, exactly. And I always work around relationships. To me, the technology, I can buy the same thing from you as an ex-guy for the most part. There might be little nuances here and there, but it's about the people. And do you trust the people? And you only get one chance to make a first impression, and I can't tell you how many times people will say to me, why did you go with A versus B? Well, A calls me back when he or she says they're going to, okay? B I'll call you tomorrow, and tomorrow comes and goes. I don't forget that.
So all these technology companies, slicks, that talk about how great their technology is and how different it is from all their competitors, are maybe not the most important thing out there.
You know what? There's differences, but at the end of the day, the base functionality is not all that different. A cloud provider is a cloud provider is a cloud provider. Yes, there's different services you can buy, different customizations and configurations you can do, but you got to trust the people, and it is truly a partnership. And look, I understand that everyone's out trying to sell. They're not there out of the kindness of their heart, but if you can't trust the person across from you, and once they break that trust, it's gone. It's just like a relationship, just like in your personal life. They've got to work at these relationships. Everybody comes into you and says, right, and I was a CEO at a major Fortune 100 company, you're a very important account to us, right? In all my years there, I never had someone come in and say, Charlie, you're not so important. I had to stop by and use the bathroom, so I thought I'd stop in and see you. Okay, everybody's important, but the fact is they can't forget about you. They've got to keep in touch. They've got to keep that line of communication going. They've got to follow through on their commitments, and it's not a flash in the pan kind of thing. The times I switched vendors were because of executional errors in their account management, taking me for granted.
I find that fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, you're right. I mean, you're working for a senior exec at a really big company. You would think that would be a very natural outcome, but I think we see this, right? That people sometimes prioritize the wrong things here, right? In terms of that.
That's right.
I also think there's a key lesson to that within IT, because we're talking about the vendors dealing with you, but guess what? We in IT are delivering services to our customers, and we need to come in with that same attitude, I think.
That's right.
And so I think it's just an interesting element to this.
Look, I ran my team as a business, and what I would say, especially to the help desk, the customer service people, at the end of the day, I want everybody contact. If someone put in a call that day, they need to get a response. The response may be your issue will be addressed tomorrow, but at least you acknowledge that communication, right? I don't want people to think their email or voicemail went into a black hole. Before you leave here at night, get back to somebody in whatever mechanism you want. Text, email, voicemail. God forbid go see them in person. Let's not forget about that. But yeah, I ran it like a business. I had a P&L, and I wanted people to be happy. And I think CIOs, CTOs have to be cognizant of the fact that in today's world, the other parts of the business can go out and contract these services without their input. I never wanted to see that. I viewed that as losing business.
Right.
And I took that personally. And then I realized as I matured that there were other roles for us to play in that ecosystem. But yeah, it's you're not the only game in town, and you better be responsive, you better be proactive, and you need to communicate with your end users just like you want your consultants, you want your vendors to communicate with you.
Right. So let's wrap this up. And this is not a feel-good meeting. I mean this genuinely. I've talked to a lot of CIOs. You truly have had one of the more interesting careers between the Olympics and the divestiture, or the split up of that you went through. And so I think you have a very unique perspective on things. As you look back on those experiences in your career, what is the one big key piece of advice that someone watching this show, an up-and-coming leader, a leader of the future, should take away and build upon?
One piece of advice. Be honest. Be honest with yourself, be honest with your team, be honest with your management, be honest with your ecosystem. If there isn't honesty and truthfulness within that world, that sphere that you're working within, nothing else matters.
Great advice. Thank you very much for being on the TransformIT show, Rich. I think people are going to get a lot out of this.
Thank you, Charlie. Pleasure.
Rich has had a fascinating career, marked by a willingness to take risks and the ability to get the big jobs done. So I found his final advice surprising. Being honest is not something that we normally talk about as a key career differentiator. But as I think through Rich's story, it seems clear that it has made a big difference for him. Through his stories, we heard how we need to be open and embrace uncertainty, that while no one likes to be the bearer of bad news, that the key to being a great leader is to accept and acknowledge that bad news as fast as you can so that you can tackle it. He shared with us that we need to stop worrying about knowing everything and to simply be honest when we don't know the answer and then to go get it. Without honesty and trust, nothing else matters. That's timeless advice. And while I think that most of us would consider ourselves to be honest and trustworthy, it's also easy to try to paint things in the most positive light possible, especially when things aren't going so great. Share your thoughts and experience with us about the role of honesty, truthfulness, and trust in your own career. You can start by joining the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag TransformIT. You can also join us here on the episode page. Also, make sure you check out the resources that both Intel and we at the IT Transformation Institute have made available for you. You can check them out at www.intel.com/IT-center and on our website at www.transformingit.org. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of the Transform IT Show. I'll see you next time. I'm Charles Araujo, and together we can change the world of IT.